May all beings have happiness in the causes of happiness. May all beings be free from suffering in the causes of suffering. May all beings dwell in equanimity, free from attachment and aversion. May all beings experience true joy, that they may be free. Namaste. So I'm Susan Barber. I'm an international yoga teacher. I've been teaching yoga for almost 20 years, practicing for about 21, 22. But for me, yoga makes my life easier to live in every aspect. Yoga is the path to the self through the self. So I was very disconnected. I was a very different person growing up. I didn't really know myself. I really didn't grow up in an environment where I was given a lot of opportunity to question things. You know, it's just kind of like, this is how it is, this is how you do, this is what you do. And a very Southern traditional family. You know, lots of what you should be doing, not who are you. So, you know, after going to grad school and going to college and doing everything right and wearing my little suits and being, you know, a little conservative Southern girl, I just went crazy. I just kind of broke free. And yoga to me, it just kind of helped me connect to myself. Like a computer, if you don't have all the wires plugged into, even the old computers, not laptops, but the old computers, you had to have all the wires in. If one of the wires isn't out, you're like, geez, which one's not plugged in here? Yoga to me was the wire that had to be plugged in. I've taught yoga all over the world. I was based in Singapore, in the Middle East, in Bahrain, and then 8 years in Europe, and now I live in Ridgewood, New Jersey for the last 18 months. I actually never really wanted to become a yoga teacher. That wasn't an ambition that I had. I really didn't start practicing yoga to become a teacher. It just sort of happened. So my teacher was a direct student of Guruji in India. Like, I'm from Ashtanga tradition. It's the practice, the physical practice is the same. In Ashtanga, we got up every day except on a full moon and a new moon, and you get up with the sun and you do your 80-minute practice. It's required. You know, I did that for 10 years. Your body's different every day. Your mind is somewhere different every day. Also, though, it's important to us that we preserve the tradition and the teachings of yoga. The business of yoga, it's important that it remains authentic. So it's really different, again, here in America than it was in India, of course. We have the yamas, the niyamas. Then we have asana, which is the postures. That's what we do in yoga class. Then we have pranayama, pratyahara. Pranayama is the breath. And you know, in my classes, I always really emphasize breath and teach different ways to breathe. Pratyahara, dharana, dhyana, samadhi. It's kind of a path up. So it's concentration, freedom from the senses, so that you're not distracted easily. And then the end is liberation and happiness and union. That's samadhi. So there's this path to get there. In Singapore, really interesting because at the time they were going through a big transformation. It's Southeast Asia, so they're surrounded by Malaysia, Indonesia, all these kind of third world countries, but Singapore is pretty close to New York. I mean, they really looked up to Americans and New York. It was kind of weird to have that like in the middle of Asia, but so there was a lot of very progressive young Chinese mostly, and then expatriates there. So it wasn't so different there actually than teaching in the States. Teaching in the Middle East was very different because they usually did not have classes together, men and women in the same class, for the locals at least, Muslim country. So my husband would sometimes come to the class. If I had any locals in the class, I would tell him he couldn't come. It was mostly women that I was teaching to. I still mostly teach to women, not exclusively, but I had women come to my classes in Bahrain in full hijab, fully covered except for their eyes, black, long, you know, the whole Middle Eastern thing. And then when they would come in, they would take it off. You know, if there were no men in the class, they could take that off and practice. Sometimes I had women trying to practice in hijab. I actually taught in a racquetball court at my complex, and I would put flyers, very old-fashioned, up at the grocery stores. I mean, you would have to be there to understand it wasn't very progressive. There's still camels walking down the street. So my vision of going to India was a cultural experience. It was about immersing myself in the culture, experiencing day-to-day life. The biggest influence to me was you can be very traditional but still also make it work for your life. I'd say Germany in yoga is probably 10 years behind here. There was a U.S. military base there, and they were looking for a yoga teacher, I heard through the grapevine. So I started teaching there to military wives whose husbands were deployed. This was during the Gulf War. Also, my big program that I started is those women that I taught, eventually their husbands started coming back. And I started to have some soldiers show up in my morning classes. And they were actually being brought by their platoon commanders, like, you have to go through the yoga. And they were like, oh, you know. And so they would come in, and they had a lot of injuries, where they had, visibly they had PTSD, they were uncomfortable, there's chanting music, you know, that reminded them of the mosques. And so we decided they needed to have their own space, so I started a program for wounded warriors. They were required to come, they weren't too happy about it in the beginning, but I think that yoga feels good. Yoga is the cessation of the fluctuations of the mind, meaning that in the end, it's not about how good your triangle pose is or your handstand. In the end, the goal at the end is to have your mind be able to be still. I'm not a devout Buddhist. You have to like accept these precepts, and you know, I like all religion actually, because you know, living in the Middle East, I had an opportunity. I think that's really been my blessing of moving all around, is I've experienced a lot of religions and a lot of cultures. So I really like religion. The light in me sees and honors the light in the divine within you. That's what Namaste means. So at the end of my classes, I say it to my students, they say it to me, then we say it to each other around the room. So I make sure all my students get a little Namaste at the end. Namaste.